Sans plus tarder, nous allons commencer. Ça fera venir les autres. Comme il est d'usage lors des colloques THS, nous tenons, en dehors des sessions scientifiques, et Dieu sait qu'il y en a eu jusqu'à maintenant et de très haut niveau, nous tenons des débats dits de société. Un premier a été consacré au problème de la vape, de la e-nicotine.
So we'd like to resume now with a society debate. We've had a lot of good scientific debates, and now we're going to be talking in ATHS once again about drug policy. We've called this debate between prohibition and legalization. What paths can be taken to ensure people's health, safety, and rights? The moderator of this discussion was to have been Eric FAVEREAU of Libération, but like others, he's caught COVID, and so he's unable to come. So once again, we're going to, at the last minute, do the moderation with Patrick Eberhard. Now, the following are going to be speaking in chronological order. First of all, Ivana Obradovic, who's the Associate Director of the French Center for Drugs and Addiction, who's going to look at the situation internationally for the questions of legalization of cannabis. This will be followed by Professor BEN LAKHDAR, who's a professor of economics at Lille. He's a specialist of the issues of the economy of the drug market. And all these presentations will be introductory. That will take about an hour because we need time for a discussion. He's going to be talking about the question of the drug economy and the market economy between massification and professionalization, with the question of violence, because even in Bayonne, people are dying for cannabis and have been shot. In third place, it's our friend, the Ambassador Milton Romani from Uruguay, who's the director of the drug program in Uruguay and was instrumental in introducing controlled legalization of cannabis. In fourth position, we're going to have an interview over video with Mrs. Ruth DREIFUSS, the former president of the Swiss body, who was for a long time president for the Global Policy Commission, and she is now a delegate, and she is going to tell us about the Swiss experience of legalization of cannabis that they are beginning to implement now. And we will then have a French experience, which is just beginning, because the mayor of Bègles, Clément ROSSIGNOL-PUECH, has come to join us, and I'd like to thank him very much for driving down. It takes 2 hours, and he's going to drive back again at the end of this meeting. And then finally, Professor Rafael Maldonado, who is replacing Professor Bernard Roch, who was the author of the report on the dangerousness of drugs, which was drafted on the request of the minister at the time, Bernard Kouchner. And Rafael Maldonado drafted the part concerning cannabis, amongst other things. Professor Maldonado has just presented the first stages in a medication that he's currently developing, which is designed to treat the disorder of cannabis use. And this is something which is extremely promising, and he's going to be talking about cannabis in terms of public health. And of course, we then have our president, honorary president, Bernard Kouchner, who has a lot of experience in his life with associations and politics, and he's continued to show an interest in all of these questions, and he will come in the discussion that's going to follow these introductory presentations. And it's also a pleasure to welcome somebody who knows the problems of information in terms of drug use and the taboo that was, I think, the situation in this country around these issues. This is Yvonne Levi, who has joined us for this discussion. So I'd like to immediately ask Ivana to come and speak, and we will make sure that each of the speakers respects their time for these introductory talks, which will last an hour in all, and then we will have an hour for discussion.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for this renewed invitation to ATHS. You know that public policies around cannabis have changed pretty much in the last decades, and different jurisdictions have decided to stop prohibition and have tried to test regulation instead of prohibition. So the objective of this presentation is to have an overview of the different regimes, knowing that most of those regimes are of the idea to try and neutralize the black market and avoid the expansion of illicit cannabis offer. But you know that more than 7,000 tons of cannabis are being seized by the police. Could be resin or raw cannabis. I need the remote control, please. Says the speaker. And I thank you very much for that. May I have my next slide? Thank you very much. I suppose that cannabis is a complex object, and often in public debate, it is something that is not well understood. You know that hemp and cannabis are just the same plant. The THC rate is very different, comprised between 1 and many percent. And so you talk about cannabis when there is more THC, but then from a botanical point of view, it's the same plant, Cannabis sativa. There are hundreds of cannabinoids in the plant. The most known is THC and CBD, tetrahydrocannabidiol and cannabidiol, but there are dozens of others. We talked about THC, and I'm sure that there is cannabisol and cannabinol, and those substances may become more popular with time. For the time being, which this is not well known. The different uses of cannabis are not monolithic, as it were, because again, what the different regulatory body wanted to do, especially in the United States, they wanted to have the same approach to cannabis as they had to alcohol or tobacco. However, cannabis is not tobacco, it's not alcohol. It is one of the first plants that have been cultivated for medicinal use, for religious use, for more than centuries, and there are also recreative uses, more hedonistic approach, and also we're talking about recreational use, and in France, hemp was never forbidden in the textile industry, in the insulation industry, so there are diverse usages, and there are different forms that are smoked, some that are inhaled, and also you have dabbing. In other words, the same type of use that is in opium. The use is also different compared with smoking. CBD, for example, is used for different objectives. It may be something that may be used in a group, as some do with alcohol, and the effects that are sought by users are also different, and there are different mechanisms of action, because one type of cannabinoid may have interactions with others, and we see that in the different tests that we do. Pure CBD is not necessarily going to solve the issues that we intend solving, and it again depends on dosage. As I said, different types of dosage and bioavailability. Bioavailability, it's the rhythm at which cannabis enters the body, and bioavailability is different whether you smoke or you chew or you inhale said cannabis. And risks are highly variable depending on age. The risk is at its highest point in teenagers. Cognitive risk, first with a risk of opportunities, especially at school, and also there are many risks for drivers. So driving under the influence, for example, is prohibited in France for the last 20 years. And unfortunately, the tests as they stand today make it possible to know whether you have or you have not consumed cannabis, but you don't know whether it's impossible to know how much was consumed or when. And eventually, the legal status of a product per se depends on the form, depends on the cannabinoids and contents of cannabinoids, whether it's a recreative use or medicinal use, medical use. Regulations vary. And last point, which is very typical to France, I would say, there's a confusion in the words that are being used, and so it's pretty, some talk about depenalization, whereby there would be less convictions, and also a regulation of the market with potentially the potential to prescribe. And there are many uncertainties. Research for decades have been hampered by the fact that the product was penalized. So only a dozen of universities worldwide were authorized, had the authorization to conduct research. Now in Northern America, there are a few more since depenalization, but there is a lot of uncertainty. You have a timeline here, which applies to the last 10 years or so. And so since 2012, 23 out of the 50 American states have legalized cannabis for recreative use. Before that, they had authorized medical use. Since 2018, you see that it's taking up speed. You see that you have a couple of states legalizing use yearly, and you have a number of localized initiatives. And you see that the federal legislation has not changed in the meantime. So at the federal level, cannabis is still prohibited. So the first country where that we had an authorization was Uruguay in 2013. Then Canada, the first G7 country, was the first to be legalized. And also there's an authorization for religious purposes in Jamaica with well-defined quantities. In Europe, things are changing slowly. Luxembourg was the first country announcing a project of legalization in 2018. It's a project of the government coalition. Then that project was reviewed. The initial project was the opening of legal shops, and then that changed to the authorization of self-culture, or rather culture for personal use, in Germany. A project, again, which was supported and backed by the government coalition, which is now delayed by this, but this program should be implemented next year. And in the Czech Republic, they also announced a similar project. Well, to date, the only country with a legal access to cannabis is Malta. By the end of 2021, they authorize cannabis social clubs, cooperatives of growers, and also the authorization to grow your cannabis for personal use. There are local experiments of controlled distribution in Switzerland. Mr. DREIFUSS shall talk about this in a moment. Pilot projects in a couple of cities. The first started in Basel, again, where they would produce and control the distribution of cannabis. And in the Netherlands, where well, you sometimes would think that cannabis is legalized since the 70s. That's actually false. They have coffee shops, but those coffee shops are supplied through a backdoor system. And so in the Netherlands, they would like to have a supply chain that would be controlled, that would supply coffee shops with fully controlled products. The common point between those different experiments in Switzerland and in the Netherlands is that they are short-lived. It's a very controlled timeline, it's assessed, and so it's the same sort of assessment that we currently have in France around medical use cannabis. This is the situation in the United States. A majority of states have authorized the medical use and recreated use. Some of the states have only authorized medical use for the time being. There are projects for reform that are ongoing in some of those states. 8 states only authorize medical access to some species that are very rich in CBD, and a few hardcore states where there's no plan for future changing regulations, so they have a strict prohibition regime. In Canada, the situation is slightly more diverse. Was legalization is pretty recent. There are 13 provinces and territories, and they're all responsible for the distribution and retail network. And so we have a patchwork of different regimes. The legal age of access ranges from 18 to 21, depending on the province. 18 in Alberta, 21 in Quebec, which is the most restrictive regime. Sales through private operators in most provinces, but sometimes it's 100% public. This is the case in Quebec, and Terre-Neuve and Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador as well. And we have hybrid models in British Columbia, where we have both public and private points of sales. Then we have the state model, which comes from Uruguay, where you may get your products directly from the pharmacy in limited quantity. All culture for personal use. This is something that you find also in Northern America, as we've seen right before. And then cannabis social clubs, for the time being, it does not exist in Northern America, but then there's a limited amount of plants that you can plant in quantities that can be sold. As a counterpart for consumers, they need to register on a, they need to write their name on the register, so to state their name, and this is something that is not necessarily well perceived in a country with a long history of very strong state. There are 5 certified public companies, 2 Uruguayan companies, and 3 more because the 2 national companies were not able to meet the demand. And the objective was not to make profit. So it's a choice which is completely different to that which was made in Northern America. The type of cannabis sold in pharmacies, there are of course, differences compared with Northern America. The rate of THC has a threshold started at 2.5, then it went to 12%, and there are 9 species with up to 50% of THC, which remains rather low when you think that the average rate of THC in resin, the type of resin that we have in France, is about 30%. Regulation through an ad hoc agency named ICA, and I think that one of our colleagues shall pick up on that later in his presentation. So legalization of cannabis is of course a very interesting topic. You see that in Uruguay there's a dedicated body. There are a few bodies as well in Northern America, but quite often the agency in charge is the same one in charge for alcohol regulation, game regulations, and also cannabis regulation. In Canada, you have a body or an agency in charge of production and control, but then the provinces are responsible for distribution and supply, as I said before. And the United States, as I said also, a patchwork of different distribution models and governance models, because the FDA is not has no competency when it comes to regulation of cannabis sold on regulated legal markets. And so again, a patchwork of different departments. So the Department of Revenue is in charge of budget and taxes. For some questions, the Department of Health is responsible. And so this requires, of course, a lot of coordination in between those different departments. Regulation. So there are different approaches to regulation. Usually what as I said, there's a registry that you have to comply with. So there's a criteria of age. You have to be a resident of a given country or territory, the access modes, the quantity. And in Canada, you know that as early as 2021 in Canada, it was possible to have medical access to cannabis, but only through online sales. But now there are brick and mortar points of sale. There's a paradox in Quebec where since 2018, cannabis is authorized, but it is forbidden to use cannabis. It's prohibited and forbidden to smoke in parks, to smoke on beaches. So it's pretty restrictive. And so some talk about prohibition 2.0 in Quebec. Also, the reform was highly a source of controversy. There were local bans, so municipalities could maintain prohibition of cannabis. As an operator on the market, you need to have a professional license, you have to be a resident, you need to have a complete overview of your entire supply chain, so traceability with software. It's an entire technology, IT technology and biotechnologies is blooming around that. Now, marketing and packaging differences and differences on advertisement. Advertisement, for example, is forbidden in Uruguay, but is authorized in some American states. Product information, especially the contents of products, and the different limits. In some countries, you're going to have more or restrained or not restrained ranges. And for example, in Canada, some products are prohibited if you have too high of a concentration. So concretely, what does it look like? In the United States, you have virtually any forms as a drink, cosmetics, in products that can be used for cooking, and also you have concentrates that can contain up to 90% of THC. So from top to bottom, you have the first forms of cannabis when legalization hardly started, especially those oils that are solid, concentrate, that can be dabbed, for example. And then you have other forms that are more and more sophisticated with more or less content in THC. Live resin, it's a new product where it's just marketing, it's not a living thing. And then you have the different wax and shutter, for example. So with those products, you have different contraptions. There's a lot of marketing behind. You have those dab rings, you have the wax pen, and you also have those portable devices that cost as much as $200. This is the third generation, so you can either use raw material or resin. You can set your temperature via Bluetooth. It's very discreet, and so you can smoke and inhale a highly concentrated product through those devices that can be used at home. So you have on that slide pictures of different countries. So in the United States, you see by now that marketing is king, and in Canada it's very different. Everything is packaged in boxes that are difficult to open for children. And in Uruguay, it's not very glamorous with pouches that look a lot more like drugs, and you have a lot of small print. When it comes to words of caution and the instruction for use, in Canada you have a dozen of symbols, and in Uruguay you see the product through the pouch. In some countries in some states of the United States, it's forbidden to sell the product in a transparent pouch. Now, before I wrap up, I would like to state the first impact of those reforms. The joint objective of this reform and legalization was to neutralize the black market, protect minors, and better control those products. In the United States and Canada, the objective was to better control medical cannabis, which was legalized in the first place, but without a decent framework. And so there were many loopholes and many gray areas. In the United States, the objective was also to try and curb a trend towards arrest because of ethnic background. Also, there was a tax objective, and the objective was to increase taxes in order to better finance, as it was stated, training and awareness reading. So again, diverse objectives. Now, there are common points in between the different jurisdictions. Among the first results is that there's no increase of use prevalence in underage, except for Uruguay, where there's a trend in increased use in underage teenagers. So no stabilization and no decrease, but that's only in Uruguay. But there was a trend that was there before legalization. There's an increase amongst adults, 25 and upwards, and also in senior citizens, probably thanks to the diverse range of products and diverse type of consumption modes. Also, what we realize in the first months, there's a wave of acute intoxication, especially following consumption of high quantity of product for of cookies, for example, cookies with cannabis. And so it was the case for children, for senior citizens, also some pets. So there were situations that made headlines in Colorado, for example. So there's a decrease in price. This is what we see almost everywhere, because again, the objective was to sell at the same price as on the illegal market, just to really start the competition. And then there's a progressive decrease of black market. The rhythm is different. For example, in Canada, 70% of consumers are buying the cannabis from the legal market, only 35% before. So it can be very quick. Now we'll stop on those differences. Unexpected effects. There's a boom of black market in California, for example, where the market is being consolidated. In 2022, they have observed a decrease in legal cannabis sales. So those players who've invested in legal cannabis are trying to divest and change their investment model. But so there were high expectations and some promises were not met. Especially there are a number of regulations on a number of markets. For example, some producers are forbidden from exporting to other countries, and also there's a lot of federal control over the border. Then the representation of risks, except for Quebec, where the representation of risks, so risks related to cannabis are well less perceived by teenagers. Almost everywhere, but in Quebec, this is not the case. This is a point of attention. And this reform is being monitored. There are a series of KPIs that are closely assessed, and there are some rather deep-ranging studies to see what are the effects of legalizations. So I think that there are three reasons for controversy, especially in Northern America: profitability of the legal market, and small producers who have not decided to go legal now complain that they have no access to this legal market. So the impact on road safety. We have pretty contradictory results of different surveys. In some states, mortality of accidents because of driving under the influence has increased, and it's not the case everywhere. And also the environmental impacts, because of course growing those plants requires lots of pesticides, energy consumption, water, and also change the landscape. And so in Northern America, those environmental challenges are more and more factored in. I thank you very much, Ivana. Thank you very much for going through this very difficult, frustrating exercise whereby you had to state many important things in a very short time. Now, we're going to give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I need the slide. Without my slides, I'm nobody. But thank you for having invited me to, well, not so much discuss or show my work about the legalization of cannabis in France, but rather to talk about the size of the market, as well as the organizations that resell drugs in France, and all of this to feed the discussion that we had previously. Well, we have an important market in France, which is not under taxes. So yes, that's right. Now, we also have to talk about massification and professionalization. We do have markets that are becoming more and more aggressive, more and more violent. There's people who die, and there are also people involved at a very young age, and this is catastrophic for their families and for themselves. So, well, I'm going to describe the evolution of the market. But I would like to underline the work that has been done by by the trend device. Here we have representatives. We have this observatory in France, which is very rich. We have to defend this. I'm not doing advocacy here, but I would like to really stress the work that has been done by the French Observatory on Drugs and Addictive Trends, because it has been very illustrative. We have, for the last 20 years, we have got different sociological and demographic work. It all started in the middle of the 90s with the National Council of Cities. They launched a study on the economy of this drugs and dealing, and with the observation that districts become poorer whenever there's a drug dealing in them. And also there are different works on the sociology of Marseille, and also works by Mohamed Narouen, and the thesis by Sarawi, and also a sociologist, Sarah Teram, who is here. And she is revealing the world of female dealers. There are also other pieces of work. In the last 20 years, I started becoming more and more interested in this, and I pursued my academical career specifying in cannabis, but also in other narcotics. So let's talk about the market. And, well, the market always starts by offer or demand. We do not know whether it's the hen or the egg which came first. But anyway, here we have a historical image of the narcotic market in France, where it seems, well, it may seem that the demand was dragging the offer in the beginning of the 80s, 90s, maybe at the beginning of the years 2000, and this is a thesis that I'm defending. It seems that we do have an offer that is pulling the demand, and we're going to see how. So, with regards to the demand, we're going to see the health barometer, and we're looking for an update actually on this health barometer actually regarding cannabis and mushrooms and so on. But you see here that between 2014 to 2017, there's a stability, a plateau of the prevalence or an increase. So regarding the main population, we do have a slight increase of users, of drug users. So I'm not going to say much more about the demand so far. When it comes to the offer, of course, we have encountered difficulties, and we do use traditional indicators like seizures at the customs. So we do have some data regarding the seizures at the customs and regarding different substances, cocaine, heroin, cannabis, so resin and weed. And the seizures have multiplied by 5. Of course, I think that the amounts to be seized, to be confiscated, have skyrocketed, both for heroin, for ecstasy, like they have doubled for heroin and ecstasy. They have been multiplied by 5 for cocaine. And you can see here that for cannabis, they have been multiplied by 1.5. And the same goes for cannabis resin. So having said that, it seems that the demand is increasing, and the offer is just measured by one indicator, the amount of confiscation at the customs. And we see that this is skyrocketing for cocaine, but there are other indicators that would allow us to see how the market's doing. Price is one of those indicators, and actually the observatory with the trend device is watching the evolution of prices. And I would like to say that in general trends, the price is stabilized or it's slightly decreasing. I mean, the price of drugs is not moving in France. So, when I go to a supermarket, I go and I I have been suffering from the inflation, from the increase of prices. So you can see here the inflation rate since 2009, and you see how it is really increasing. But this does not affect the drug market. So maybe we could think that the quality of the product has decreased, but let me tell you that since 2010, the concentration, the content of cocaine and THC in those confiscations lower than 10 grams, well, we're talking about these levels of purity that have increased actually up to almost 70%. So we're talking about the fact that rice growers have called specialists in order to have been called by specialists of drugs in order to keep the purity of the product. So given the prices, given the purity, and in spite of the fact that inflation should be acting as a tax on products, in spite of all this, we do have cheaper products in France. So it's actually because the demand is increasing. So I have to say that the market is quite dynamic, and it doesn't get the full impact of the police, and so it does not increase in price. So in the market with Sophie Nassin, we have tried to discuss and calculate the magnitude of the market in value and in volume. So we're trying to do this because the Eurostat is asking us for this kind of data. And, well, we need to give a kind of idea of the turnover of the drug market in France. So based on the demand, we can estimate the number of users in France. We can also estimate the intensity of and frequency of their use. And then if we multiply that by the price, we can get the individual expense. And this gives us a rough idea of the turnover of this market in France. So you can see here the most updated data, actually. So the estimations are 3 billion of turnover, and actually in 2017 we're talking about 4 billion. So we have the expense of users, and this represents a turnover for the market, for the drug industry. And well, it is increasing, and this is driven by cannabis, which moves from 1 billion to almost 2 billion. And the same goes for the rest, except for heroin, which is decreasing. And now we do have the last figures from 2017, so we need another update. And maybe we can expect that things are not going to change so much for cannabis. But we do expect that cocaine will still increase, and cocaine will be the first market in terms of turnover in France. So actually what I'm saying is that cannabis is not the issue anymore. So these are the estimations. The MIDECA asked me for some estimations. So here are the amounts, the estimated amounts of cocaine, depending on the regions. So we're talking about a total amount of tons in 2017 of 50 tons in 2010, 15 tons at 30% of purity. And now we have more users, and they use higher quality products. Now, if we see the map here of these products that are used, we can see some routes. We can see that in Occitania, we can see that at that time in 2012, we had the Spanish route that was quite prolific when it comes to to moving cocaine, and I'm sure that today in Normandy we would have higher amounts of cocaine that are used. And for heroin, we see this access through Switzerland. Therefore, if I was a financial expert and a financial advisor, I would say that the drug market is doing very well. So we do have a very high demand, and we do have an offer, a supply, which responds to this demand thanks to high-quality products. But much more than this, because organizations have also changed in recent years. We were used to represent organizations for import and export for drugs with simplistic schemes. I mean, it was quite a free market. It was not very well represented. So this would be the kind of movement of heroin from the producer to the user. And, well, there might be also small producers who would resell to their friends. Now, for cannabis, there was this pyramidal structure which would go from bulk selling to retail. So these were the representations of the organizations for the different drugs. Today, sociologists are working on this, and the trend device is working on this, and today we're moving from a pyramidal structure to an organization which is quite different. This organization is quite disconnected from the ground, from what's happening in the field. So actually, we're moving from this pyramidal to an organization where the points of sale are important. So there would be the base of the pyramid, but the field operators depend on themselves. And actually, there are certain negative externalities and certain harm and risk that are taken by these resellers, but there would be also the tip of the pyramid, which would be disconnected from this because of violence, and this would be a structure per se. So this structure would be composed by lawyers, by laundering specialists, by other kinds of specialists, also by investors, even by investors. So today, this is in a very small font, and I'm sorry about this, but today with Michel Perradi and with other colleagues, we're trying to draw one of the realities of these organizations to resell cannabis and cocaine. So you see here that we would have different functions that are assumed by different roles, by different positions. We would have some managers, we would have some advisors, we would have an entire administration around this. And well, this is quite difficult to understand, but there are maybe investors and financial experts who would be involved and who would expect a return for their investment. So, and then we do have another kind of organization from the point of sale and to the end user, but we do have a manager between the top part and the bottom part, and there would be human resources expert and accountants, but also a treasurer and a person who would be in charge of watching all of this. And then at the bottom of the pyramid, we would have all the resellers and all the workers, let's say, with also some dealers and those who request and who are the first victims of drug trafficking. So you see that there's this kind of professionalization because we're starting here to attribute functions and roles to these people. And actually, Thomas Rada has worked a lot on this, and he's a professor of management in the University of Normandy. And he says that the organizations in the drug industry are mimicking legal organizations and legal businesses. I was saying before that it seems that the offer is trying to pull the demand through different techniques that would be qualified as marketing techniques. So let me show you what we refer to when we talk about primitive marketing. And there are this idea of the 4 Ps. You know, the 4 Ps, we can be talking about legal products. And in this case, of course, we're talking about organizations which are trying to mimicking legal products. So the first P is the P as in product. And then there's price. Price which has to be adapted to a certain budget and has to be proposed as well with some promotions as much as possible. And place and access. Place and access, well, the product needs to be accessible, and the delivery as well is incorporated into the different techniques of the organization. So you don't even need to move. You can get the product delivered to you. And then in the end, there's publicity or advertisement. So we need an appealing brand that makes us eager to buy, and this through the use of different media. So do we find these 4 Ps that we find in primary marketing? Well, the answer is yes. And I'm giving you some examples here. And I'm sure that you've seen this. There's this menu that you can access. So there's different varieties of weed and cannabis. So different prices for different target publics. And here we're talking about this picture of resin. So this is Moroccan, and the packaging, well, we often see packaging for cannabis resin. Mula is a classical picture, actually. And we see that there's also this kind of gift card or reduction card. If you buy 10 times, you will get a reduction or a free product. And well, organizations, you see that the communication isn't short here. You can see all the offer and the different prices. You can see GBL 100 milliliters at 50 euros. Well, I'm just showing you this because, you can see the different recommendations. Enjoy, have fun, and get hydrated and eat. So these are the recommendations by sellers. And so I just love it. And, opposite to smoking industry, they just want the clients to be alive. Anyway, there's also the importance of graffiti here, and it really shows what cannabis represents. Here we have different examples which say we're open from 10 a.m. to 11 p.m. Certain graffiti artists have been charged for drug trafficking. So we see that the network of drug trafficking can be something very wide. So these graffiti artists are considered as accomplices, people to drug dealing networks. And we find these accessible prices with some requirements depending on different clients and different target publics so that we can reach as many people as possible. So we have different formats like this pouch, or also this Eppendorf tube, or this little box, again, another pouch, 0.1 gram for 10 euros, or the prestige packaging. So this may look quite fun, actually, but I think that we need to dig in a little bit more and see the intentionality behind. Maybe there's not a lot of awareness here, but there is a kind of movement to differentiate regarding the competition and to reach a certain clientele. So, well, I'm going to finish and tell you about this new space. We do have certain specialists here in the room, and I'm not an expert, but there are certain things that we ignore. The dark net, for example. I think that we have not yet researched these new spaces for drug dealing, like the dark net. So how do we sell? What is the proportion? To whom we sell? But I'm sure that there are many things going on there. So in conclusion, we do have a dynamic market with organizations which are becoming more and more professionals, and we need a political response. Thank you very much. No questions? No questions? Well, then it's great. Now it's Milton Romani, 5 minutes.
Passo il micro et après c'est Ruth. ¿Qué pasa en Uruguay?
¿Qué pasa en Uruguay? En Uruguay pasa que...
So what is going on in Uruguay? We're going to be celebrating 100 years since the first football championship that we won at the Olympic Games in Paris 100 years ago. First of all, now this is for a change. Now, first of all, let's change. Let's change the model of regulation, because we haven't created a model. What we've done is change the control and the regulation, and regulation that's in the whole world. And after I've heard what my colleague has just said, it's currently in the market, in the black market. The activity of the agents is being maintained in this market. So let's start out with that. In Uruguay, has carried out an experiment, which is an experiment which is positive and shows clearly that you can regulate and control the cannabis market, and even perhaps take the first step towards regulating other types of substances. So the question is it a good thing or not? And I think it is good because, as we heard right at the beginning, this is a way of resuming control, taking back control and countering the power of organized crime, the power of the political power in our democracies, because organized crime doesn't just stop with marketing drugs. Of course, it's something which goes much further, which can emerge in different areas. So what is the situation at the moment in Uruguay? As we heard earlier, the law was adopted in 2013, and we were able to implement this law from 2017 onwards, because we had to cope with a number of threats. We were sabotaged. There was a lot of opposition, but I have to say that today, with the change in the government, now we have a right-wing coalition, but this coalition was keen to maintain this regulated market. They've introduced other modifications in other areas. They've reached agreements with the police, and they've tried to penetrate the system, but in a different way. So as you can see, Elena was talking about this in an article published in 2018. We were able to read that the market or the regime in Uruguay has its own specific characteristics, just as any other market, or the policies that are applied for regulating drugs. When clinicians, for example, look at our patients, it's the same thing. There's no program is like any other. And in Uruguay, there's a tradition, a liberal tradition in the good sense of the term. And there is an agency which is there to regulate that. The state is there to regulate, to give permits. And we have permits for culture, for growing, for adult use. We have 13 authorizations. For medicinal use, we have 13 for industrialization. There is research, there are laboratories, and there are other operations. But the institutions depend on the drug organization, which is an organization which depends on the presidency of the Republic. So every 6 months, the IRCA meets, and this is the report of June 2023, 30th of June, and takes stock of what has been done in the 3 areas which are controlled by the government: cannabis for adults, the use in industry, and for recreational use. And there are 3 ways of accessing this. This is self-growing with six plants per family. There are also social clubs. We have 300, and we have a system in pharmacies. So this is the easiest way of accessing these substances. Everybody has to register, and that registration does raise problems, but I think we've found a good way of regulating this registration. And this is one of the dimensions from the point of view of citizen safety. And it's a point which has been very successful. I think we have been able to make this safe, or at least to obtain levels of safety, which are a good level. At the moment, we have 6,000 people who no longer buy drugs on the black market. They buy their cannabis in a regulated way. This represents 34% approximately of the total market of users, but in a very broad sense, because those who grow their own cannabis, even people who go to the clubs, they share and they use part of their production. But I think that we're reaching 51% of the market of users and consumers. And I don't know if it's not a lot or if it's a great amount, but it's very successful, and it's taken us a long time. First of all, we needed to control the chain of distribution, the supply chain. We had a network of pharmacies that was ready to follow us, but then they decided to move aside from our policy. We have a lot of pharmacies. There are 3.5 million inhabitants, but there's a small network of pharmacies. And then it was the International Bank which tried to prevent us from doing this. The International Bank tried to forbid all the bank accounts working in this area. First of all, the central bank, and then all the other banks. We needed to find a solution. And Washington and Colorado, the income was so important that the bank began to realize that it was interesting for them to move into this activity, because for some time we had to work with a direct payment or hand-to-hand payment and so on. But that, of course, doesn't solve all the problems that we had in terms of cohabitation, the problems of violence in the streets and so on. But the most significant criticisms
Bien. Esta es la última
Okay.
encuesta.
So this is the most recent survey that's been carried out on drug consumption for students in secondary schools. We carry out a survey every 2 years. We do a survey also for the population in general. The most recent survey, we were able to observe that the consumption of cannabis in this population, young people, had a certain growth that we have been observing over the last 11 years. But we were able to work with Madame Madeleine Servat, who's the director for the opiate policy at the health department at the University of New York, and with Professor Rossaido-Pero, they have carried out a study in China and in Argentina. And this enabled us to verify that the legal standard, or the legalization and the control of marijuana, could increase consumption. So I have a personal idea, my own personal view on this. The consumption of substances does not depend on the legal framework, and prevention doesn't depend on the legality of a substance. So we could talk about whether legalization or criminalization is perhaps a false problem, because there are sometimes things do have to be prohibited, and sometimes things, when they're legalized, do cause damage to health. For example, that's been described for opiates in the United States. So opiates which were not distributed by organized crime, but by the pharmaceutical industry, which said that these products were not addictive. And this situation is one we find with regard to the legalization of marijuana. And there's been a whole series of laws for the case of the introduction. For example, we had seen this with the debate about abortion or about free marriage. The conservatives said that if you have abortion, then if you legalize it, there would be an increased demand on the part of women for abortion. That's what they said. And in a sense, the sales of cannabis shows that this is a false idea, this conservative vision, which doesn't allow the real exercise of rights. So I think, and I can assert this, that in my country, we can give a positive vision. We have a lot still to do, and I've heard our friend talking about the operation of the black market. We can say that we can see that there's a real economic power, that these are steamrollers of the economy, and this is going to have an impact on health and cohabitation, and that moving into legalization will change this substantially.
On est finalement à un point d'arrêt. Ça ne marche pas. La politique en France sur les drogues ne marche pas. Nous l'avons constaté il y a très longtemps, je ne dirais pas combien de temps, parce que ce ne serait pas très gentil pour ceux qui...
We see that drug policy does not work. We see that, yeah, we've always said that it didn't work. And maybe it's because of the legislation. And maybe it's because it is unfair and it doesn't work, and it's also very costly. because what we're saying here about the effectiveness of networks and their considerable turnover, well, it's really very costly for society in terms of health, in terms of safety, and in terms of people's rights, actually. And I think that we're talking about situations, about countries, and we've always been interested in the relationship between health and human rights. There's a great doctor called Jonathan Mann who was driving us into that direction, and he was very responsible about this. And I think that now, well, I'm going to introduce you to an exceptional lady, and she comes from Switzerland. And she is the first person to have been appointed minister, female minister, and then she was appointed as Home Office Minister and a Minister of Health. And she developed different legislation on drugs, and she's a very convinced person, and she tried to really drive us. And we actually didn't achieve to do everything that she achieved, but her results are considerable. And this is the first country where heroin injection has been allowed under medical supervision in a population that is, of course, very much deprived. And she thought about the three pillars in Switzerland: prevention, therapy, and risk reduction, as well as repression. But repression comes at last. So when she ended her political mandate in Switzerland, then she became director of the Global Commission for Drugs. And this is a foundation which is very close to the United Nations, and actually they are really advocating for a change of policy. So Honorable DREIFUSS is an admirable lady, and she is a mentor, and she has always been very busy, but this year she was actually, she really honored us with her presence, and you were going to see that she is very moderate, and but she's also full of energy.
Sur le problème de que la suite s'apprête à faire.
So we're going to discuss the situation in Switzerland. Yeah, the situation, not the problem. So a number of reforms have been implemented in Switzerland in the last 3 decades, and I would like to discuss more precisely. First, in Switzerland, what we do is we try out things and then we change our regulation. So first, we start with a knowledge base in order to help with the decision making. And only when it works, we just set that into the law. And I see that there was a reform in 2008, a reform of the regulation on the use of drugs, and the results of the vote was very tight, I have to say. But the question was asked to the citizens, and one of the sentences was, we need to provide a legal basis to the strategy that has been implemented for the last 20 years in Switzerland. So in other words, we started with an anticipation. So we started with the finding of solutions, and then afterwards we adopted our regulation. So we were already very clear as to what was happening with recreational use of cannabis. And so the use of recreational cannabis dates back to 1999. This is when I made a proposal in order to change the regulation. And I failed initially. But after that, the debate continued. There were contradictory opinions, But then an idea cropped up, and we thought, well, let's try and see what it would look like if cannabis was legal. So this only required a small change in the law, which was accepted Parliament. And so we said the following in the law. We said we are going to change a number of articles in the existing law so that we can start pilot studies. Those pilot studies had different designs, and we would test different models, and those were different avenues, and we wanted to experiment as to where would be the consequences of changing the law, of changing the distribution model, what would be the safety measures that we had to introduce. And again, the objective was to amass and harness enough information and enough evidence in order to provide and shed some light and also inform the decision makers. And you know that there are different models in Uruguay, in Colorado, and Switzerland is currently using a test to see what would be a solution that would be adapted to our country. So that was the rationale back then. So there were a number of rebukes, and we had to respect a number of authorizations. But obvious to say that 5 cities and cantons received the authorization: Basel, Zurich, Bern, Lausanne, and Geneva. And so in those 5 towns or cantons, they had the right to experiment on recreational use of cannabis. For example, for Geneva, we selected about 1,000 individuals that could get some cannabis for recreational use. And in other cities, they decided to not use a regular point of sale, but rather use, there was a project in Zurich of a social club, cannabis social club, and in yet another city, they decided to supply cannabis through the pharmacies. And so some of those outlets are already functioning, and in Lausanne and Geneva, they're about to open their point of sale. On Thursday, last Thursday, I had an interview with the citizens who live in the neighborhood where the shop will be located. Invitations were sent to the citizens of the neighborhood, and they were invited to a meeting. And during the meeting, they had the opportunity to ask questions and also to voice their concern. And we will continue because we want to be supported by the local population, and we want to collect their reactions. What's very important, of course, is that all those projects are assessed from a scientific point of view with different teams, with representatives of the Department for Health, and also there will be a number of results published. There will be a comparison with the type of results that is obtained, that are obtained elsewhere internationally, and then we'll start the political process. I have to say that the political process has actually already started. There's an initiative in Parliament, and currently, with the support of the federal government, there's currently a draft that's currently being studied to help with the potential scaling up of those pilot studies. The Parliament currently is not making has not reached their conclusions. So for the time being, we have two procedures that are happening at the same time because they want to collect experts' opinion. But I'm rather optimistic, and I think that the decision will be reached sooner than later. And I think that there will be a legalization at the national level. And then we shall, of course, decide what are the details. But I'm under the clear impression that we first started, of course, with a long phase. And maybe I'm a bit impatient by nature, but I accept and I appreciate that it's important to know where we are going before we go somewhere. And I would like, and I see that a number of European countries are following suit. It's the case with Germany, it's the case for Netherlands as well. They are trying to regulate the production side of things to supply their coffee shops. Same goes for Malta, and we know that Spain is interested. So I will say that in Europe, I think that things are changing, and I think we have an approach with it which is science-based, but we are also basing the decision-making on informed decision-making. For political reasons, cannabis and cannabis use has been poorly understood, poorly integrated in our controlled approach of drugs, and the lack of scientific knowledge was certainly at fault. And so we need, of course, to categorize the different substances. And when it has to do with decision-making, I think it's a good idea to start with a sound knowledge base. Can we ask a question? You know that in France, the problem we have with cannabis is that it represents 90% of what the police has to contend with. In a number of cities, there's a surge of violence because of cannabis traffic. And we are in favor of legalization, and we think that, of course, it would help with reducing that violence. From your Swiss experience, from the Swiss model, can you say a couple of words on prevention? The fact that you have a policy which is a lot more flexible on recreational use of cannabis, so more flexible but controlled. Well, could you say about what you've seen in Switzerland? Of course, cannabis would not be of free access to underage teenager, and it would not be possible to drive under the influence, of course, but provided those prerequisites are met, maybe it would change stigma, and maybe it would help with the current violence. Answer by Ruth DREIFUSS. In the policy around fight against drugs, the police played a very positive role in that. They were very accepting of evolution in regulation, and they decided to help and support healthcare professionals, and also with those people that would be responsible of the point of sales or would be responsible for reaching out and training the population. So I remember very well that initially, when we started this entire approach in favor of legalization, initially the police was in despair, almost in despair, because they thought that they would be faced with being responsible for arresting a dealer on the street, while knowing that said dealer would be replaced the next morning, and also despaired because not being able to charge that person and see that person walking free, because when arrested, probably they would be detaining a small quantity of drugs. And so maybe to see those people, those dealers, freed from jail a couple of weeks later with a smirk on their face. So there was a feeling from them that it was a waste of resources, waste of financial resources, and waste of human resources, their resources. And so the police forces initially were rather in favor. We had the policeman trade union, and they were on our side when we were looking for a new solution. And you have to understand that we really involved all the stakeholders, also private associations, because they all have a role to play. And what's important is that we do not sabotage one another, and we need to be able to work together. You know that I know the situation in Geneva a lot better because I know the head of the Users Association. And from the very start, we had a very nice working relation with the police and the trade union. And we were able to help them with safety, and also they were able to provide recommendations for the safety in the point of sale. And if, for example, someone is arrested or rather stopped in the street, they need to have a pouch of recently so if someone purchases cannabis in a shop, they need to carry the product in the sealed pouch until they reach their home. They are not supposed to open the pouch in the street. And of course, they are not allowed to use cannabis in their car. So the police helped us with defining those criteria. And I think that I can say now that they are in favor of legalization because they are aware that it's going to make their life easier, and they are going to have less work to do when it comes to regulating traffic. It will be helpful from a community standpoint as well. So this model will be assessed. We will assess the impact on violence, and I think it helps in it helps again the police in concentrating their efforts on finding the managers of those networks and not concentrating on small dealers. And those small dealers will probably help eventually locate those who are responsible for the head of that traffic. Right, so that was the testimonial by Ruth Dreyfus. Now we are going to be
Now it's
very
a pleasure to listen to the mayor of Bègles, Mr. Rossignol-PUECH, who
is the mayor
has,
of
to a certain
Bègles,
extent, taken
and he
the decision
decided
to follow the
Swiss
model.
model from his own initiative, so to speak.
That's right, that's correct,
And
yes.
so there we go.
I'd like to thank the organizers, first of all, for having invited me. I'm bringing out my watch here so that I can make sure that I keep time during this discussion. And I will try and be as short as possible in the 10 minutes I have. I'm the mayor of Bègles. Bègles is on the outskirts of Bordeaux. It has 30,000 inhabitants. And like all mayors in France, there's a lot of drug trafficking and so on, prostitution and drugs. These are all the different forms of trafficking that are carried out. Narcotics, particularly cannabis, but I would agree that cocaine is arriving in these towns around Bordeaux, and also the cannabinoids, synthetic cannabinoids. And we wanted to organize a survey to establish what the situation was, and the trafficking was reduced in certain areas, but then picked up again in areas some short distance away. And we had a very bad surprise recently, somewhere between Bègle and Bordeaux. There was shootings of rival gangs trying to take over the territories. So the traffic is there, dealing is there. I don't think we've reached the levels of Marseille, but there have been 42 deaths connected with narcotics dealing, particularly cannabis. I think this is a real issue for mayors, and we're having to deal with something which we have very little control over. And of course, the population come to see us very often. The consumers have come to see us, or children, parents, and explaining that the young people, sometimes very young people, had issues with cannabis dealing in secondary schools in France between people between 11 and 15. Like 12-year-olds may well be confronted with cannabis usage. So the parents come in and say, what can I do? My son is 14, he's smoking. I don't know what he's smoking. I don't know whether he's vaping and he gets cannabis, or there are some older children and their old parents are worried about their cannabis consumption. And parents are maybe even older people in retirement homes. Not easy to get drugs in retirement homes, and they don't know what they're buying for their parents. So we don't know whether they're buying for their parents or if they're consumers, or they buy on internet now. You don't even have to go onto the dark net. You can have a delivery at your home. So it's a challenge that all mayors know, and I've started out by trying to read about this. I read the information about the regulation of the different forms of cannabis. There's a parliamentary report published in 2021 by Renaissance, that is the Macron party, drafted this report. And it's a right-wing report. And the Environmental and Economic Council on the 24th of January 2023 concluded for the first time that it would be a good thing to have controlled legalization of cannabis, to have a public health policy, and to control the various people involved, and to have an economic model for cannabis. Because I think this is said, France had a tradition of growing hemp for textiles and ropes, which has been lost. I have a colleague who's the mayor of Guéret, or the president of Guéret Métropole, who's been fighting for some time for the Creuse department to becoming a department which would be producing hemp for textiles and also for therapeutic cannabis. He didn't dare go towards recreational cannabis, but is pressing for the Creuse to be able to develop in this way. So what I did was I asked the President of the Republic, I sent a mail and I tweeted, and this created a bit of a buzz on the social networks. I wrote to the President and I said that I wanted Bègle to be a place for local experimentation of controlled legalization of cannabis. And the President replied saying that he took good note of my request and asked the prefect of the region and the Interior Minister to look at my application. So I'd like to thank a certain number of people who are present here who have been helping us here. There's been a scientific committee and also a citizens committee to try and construct, in a context of participative democracy, with the help of experts, try and see what this controlled experiment could be in a town of 30,000 inhabitants on the outskirts of Bordeaux. So we have a tribune and with a certain number of personalities, politicians and scientists. We organized a conference with 200 people, with members of the Economic and Social Council and a certain number of personalities that I'd like to thank. It was very serene in Bègle. I thought it was going to be very conflictual, but we wanted to change. If you want to change the direction of a street or add some parking spaces, it's much more difficult than legalizing cannabis. So we put posters everywhere in the town saying, come and discuss legalization of cannabis. There were 200 people who came, and it was very constructive. Some people were a bit worried, didn't want Bègles to become Amsterdam, to become a particular place for growing cannabis and cannabis tourism in France or in Europe. Young people are going to be taking drugs. And we said, no. I think when we explained that that was not what we were doing, they were interested. I'd like to thank Jean-Michel Delille. I thank Marc Aubry-Ocon. I'd like to thank you too for helping us. Fuchasse, and of course, Christian BEN LAKHDAR, thank you very much for helping you. So what could this experimental approach look like? We have had a lot of discussions and it's in progress. It hasn't been finalized. Would be a panel between 50 and 100 people from Bègles with a representative panel in terms of age, gender, social and economic background, different parts of the town, sometimes very conservative, sometimes consumers. There had to be a question of over 18, under 18, ages and so on. We find that 18 was the right cutoff point. It would be a municipal area where a cannabis social club could be organized for these people, would be monitored by a multidisciplinary team, would look at their changes in their consumption over a year or 2 years. There would be locally produced cannabis produced by a professional, and the consumption would be the flower of the cannabis plant with variable rates depending on the consumption of the people. We were looking more at vaping, which are the least harmful forms of consumption of cannabis. It could be consumed either in situ, but also at home. And of course, that leaves a lot of problems about transporting cannabis, because if you restrict this too much to please the government to have a chance of having an authorization, we won't have the panelists who are going to come to the experiment. We don't want it to be overly medical. And if we open it up too much, then we won't get the authorization. So this is really something of a tightrope, whether it should be anonymous or not. And of course, we need to have a prevention campaign, an educational campaign to increase the knowledge about the use of cannabis, which in France is not very well developed. I discussed informally with the prefect of the region and the departments in the prefects, the national police, the justice department, and so on. Officially, they're against, but in actual fact, they are willing to listen. They say, Mr. Mayor, if you succeed, that's fine, because they say for the justice department, we said we have too much work to do with all these small dealers and so on. So if you can succeed, that's fine. I think it's the role of a mayor to carry the national debate forwards. Working up at my own level, 3 weeks ago, we got a letter from the Minister of the Interior and said they were opposed. But we are still highly motivated. We're going to finalize the experimentation. We're going to be looking for letters of support from a lot of personalities. And I will go and place this on the president's desk, and there'll be a discussion. And if I don't get the authorization of this government, then we will continue and wait for the next government to give us the support that we need. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire, pour ce bel exemple de vie participative.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for this very nice example of participatory life and commitment. It's not easy, but you're making it really. And we do hope that others will follow. Now, we're going to talk about the ROC report. I don't know if you remember that. And it's true that it was about Bernard Kouchner, who was the Minister of Health, and this led to a lot of discussion from ROC, Minister of Health, and well, he will not be here with us, but he sent to us one of his collaborators and researchers, Rafael Maldonado, a Spaniard from Barcelona. And we're going to hear about the ROC report on cannabis. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm actually from Andalusia. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the recent scientific studies that have been published about the consequences of cannabis legalization. It's scientific studies, so we have talked about this, and there's a very important factor. This is education policies, information policies coming from the public administration. But we also need to remember that there are other sources of information which do have a very important role to play in public opinion and in the perception of risk and in the end in use. We have to think about the role of social media and everything that is available in the internet. And I would like to present a scientific study that has just been published and how social media is considering this issue of cannabis legalization. Of course, we have the main social media, Facebook, Instagram, the former Twitter, but half of them will not recognize the legalization of cannabis. And paid publicity is forbidden for most of these social media. However, free advertisement is allowed. It is permitted in most of these social media. So you know, it's actually something that leads to some reflection, to some thought. And we have to think that, of course, well, selling is forbidden in social media. However, we need to remind that the age to access this kind of social media is very different. I mean, you can have an Instagram account regardless your age. However, free advertisement of cannabis is not permitted. So we do have to think a little bit about this social media. There's another scientific study which was published this year as well, which encompasses Canada, all of Canada, and it's the Canadian Cannabis Survey. So before legalization and after that. So they have data about the consumption of cannabis in the past year. And to be honest, there's not an enormous difference. And remember, it was in October 2018 that cannabis was legalized in Canada. But we still need to stress that there is a difference between men and women. And this difference, men tend to use more than women. Well, this difference, this gap, is getting reduced. I mean, there's not a very important difference amongst men, but it's true that use is increasing a little bit amongst women. And if we think about the daily use and risk consumption, well, there is quite a change there, because we see that there is not an important change between, before and after legalization, but we see that risk consumption is increasing amongst men. So it's quite a different profile, that of men and women. If we still remain in Canada, there's another study that tells us about the frequency of use. And again, there is not such a big difference. So, before legalization, regular users or frequent users, well, we see a slight increase of that group after legalization. And those who had never used, well, there is also a slight increase. But what is reduced is the number of occasional users. So this is in Ontario. And, well, these are quite recent studies, but well, In the case of Ontario, we are talking about young adults. The first study encompassed the entire population of Canada. And now if we run a meta-analysis regarding the latest study about cannabis use after legalization amongst teenagers, well, there's a lot of controversy depending on the different studies. I mean, there's a study from Quebec that shows no significant difference. However, there is another study from the USA that shows that certain population, well, users of electronic cigarettes, well, this population has increased. And then we're talking about another group of users, those who both smoke cannabis and use other substances. So there are certain increases amongst teenager populations. And young adults, well, in the case of young adults, the data is not so controversial. There's a study in Washington and Wisconsin that shows a slight increase, and another one showing another increase. And in Oregon, there is also another study showing an increase amongst young adults who drink alcohol. So there are certain populations which are increasing according to those studies. And here, for example, in the US, there's an increase from non-user to cannabis user. And then, for those who are positive to THC, there's an increase in California. However, there are other studies which do not show any significant change. So there's a trend to increase, but there is no significant increase. So it seems that the increase is somewhere there, but it's not really significant. So what's going on now regarding legalization and the relationship with alcohol use? In Washington, there's another study showing that there's an increase in alcohol use after cannabis legalization. Another study from Oregon showing that heavy drinkers have a higher risk. And in California, there's a study, a huge study actually with concerning 3 million people, showing that there's an increase of alcohol users amongst teenagers. We're talking about alcohol use. So we're relating here cannabis legalization and alcohol use. And this is what scientific literature is telling us. Now, opioid use after cannabis legalization. Well, there are certain studies which do not point out any modification, any change in the situation in the US. However, other studies in Canada, in British Columbia, and in Colorado that show a significant reduction in opioid use after cannabis legalization. And we can talk about prescribed opioids and other opioids. And again, we find this different between genders. And the reduction is higher amongst women. And also there's a reduction of deaths because of or after cannabis legalization. So again, we find somehow contradictory results. And now regarding crime after legalization, after cannabis legalization, well, we have this study in Canada that tells us that crime is reduced both amongst men and women in Canada after legalization. So, well, it may seem that the data is clear, but it's not so clear. And in the US, we have the same author who ran a study in Oregon, and there's an increase in crime after cannabis legalization. However, the same author is showing that the situation is different in Washington, where crime is reduced. So these are the results. I mean, this is what has been published. And now regarding driving, a car driving, this is also quite an issue. And the studies tell us that there is no difference. Half of those studies, I'm talking about Colorado, Washington, California, they show that there's no difference. However, the study from British Columbia, Colorado, Washington, again, Washington, in this case, there's an increase. And there's also a study in Illinois, and the result is quite curious because it shows that there's an increase of driving-related outcomes in large cities. So this is what we find out in Uruguay. So again, you know, there are studies which make us reflect a lot because we may be inclined to think that these driving-related outcomes would increase. And now there is another curious issue. It's the relationship between cannabis legalization and mental health outcomes. We may be prone to say that there would be an increase in mental health issues, but many studies show no changes. There's a study that shows that anxiety increased amongst women, but most studies do not show any difference. There's a study, however, that has been published in Molecular Psychiatry that tells us about very interesting results. They make the difference between legalization and commercialization. So legalization, well, they tell us about the same results. There's no difference in terms of mental health outcomes after legalization. However, when it comes to commercialization, we see an increase of mental health issues. So from March 2020 to September 2021, there is a significant increase of 30% odd ratio. But what kind of population are we talking about? We're talking about young adults between 19 to 24 years. So the consequence there is an increase in mental health issues and psychiatric diseases. But no changes in rates of cocaine or methamphetamine-induced psychosis. So these studies tell us that it's very specific to commercialization and not legalization. So the conclusion is we need additional studies because it seems that there are no major modifications. However, there are certain differences in gender, and we have to think about this. And there's also this difference in terms of mental health outcomes amongst young adults after commercialization. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So there's a lot of work to do. Mr. Kouchner. Well, I think that, well, all this should make us reflect. I would like to say something, and maybe we will have the opportunity to debate a bit more tomorrow. But as I said, well, we have to discuss about the relationship between a minister and the change of legislation. And you know that for many years we tried to change the law. And of course, some people in this very room can witness of it. we wanted to change the law regarding cannabis, depenalization of cannabis. And well, how we got obstacles and barriers from everywhere. I'm sure that tomorrow we will be able to talk about this a bit more. And I have to say that, well, it was fascinating to do so. And well, taking all these contradictory considerations and trying to draw a conclusion, well, this is not easy, but we have to do it. And I would like to share my feeling with you about all of this after having heard, how to say this, after having heard what may happen once the market is open. And I would like to thank the mayor of Bègle for giving national consistency to this. And I thank him as well for having confronted in an anticipated manner some of the consequences. Well, I have to thank him, and I will be very happy to follow up this example in the field. But I see the modelization of the market, of the drug market, and cannabis, since it's the first substance of interest for us. And I would like to ask the question, but tomorrow we'll have to address this issue with the cruelty of truth. What's going to happen for hard drugs? What is going to happen with dealers? Because we have to think about this. We're happy for all the slight steps forward that we made about thinking of a potential legalization, and I'm being very cautious here. But of course, this is not enough. We need to go further on, and I think that the experience of Bègle in a site that is quite different from Ontario, from what's going on in Canada, I would also like to address tomorrow the problem of violence. And I was happy to see after your presentation, sir, that crime, especially violence, is regressing when cannabis and maybe other substances are openly sold. I'm sure this is a very important argument and something that the police is going to hear and to welcome. But you know, the police forces in France, it's not that they don't have the willingness to do anything, it's just that they have to abide by the law. And we have to say that there's a lot of motivation for this restrictive legalization. And the police is so busy dealing with small dealers. So we need arguments for the police forces, and we need these arguments. And I was also very happy to hear that we need to discuss about information and training, and this happens in schools. So what do we have to do in schools? We need to provide information in schools, and we need to tell them what the substances are and what is the method and what kind of reality they have to face. So of course that I understand that there are many programs, but we need to tell parents about reality. And one last thing I'd like to say regarding this process that we could start with the police. Well, let me say that in all the contacts that we have had throughout the years with the police forces, well, we met very understanding people. It's not that they wanted to split between morale and law and then being laid down and being a drug user. I mean, they were quite understanding, but it was not possible to lead to a common reasoning. So tomorrow we're going to discuss much more about all these problems, and I'm going to describe to you the daily life of a minister who wants to change things. Of course, about quite a precise problem, but we were pretty sure, and we were quite convinced of what we wanted. And it was not that we wanted to do any damage. We didn't want people to be sick or to die. But I think that a piece of legislation that is not applied or that is not enforced is not a good piece of legislation. But, you know, well, people are leaving the room. I'm not pointing them. But I would just like to thank you all. And tomorrow we're going to discuss. Oh, the boss is saying that we can continue. Well, we do have 15 minutes. If there are reactions or anything in the room, we can do that. So there's one question, one comment there at the end of the room. Yes. Miguel from the SCAS. In ASUD, we are stricken by the situation in France. And, well, we have just heard the Swiss lady who told us about all these countries who have committed to different attempts and they're moving forward. And maybe they're moving forward blindly, but they are still moving forward. Whereas in France, we are in a situation of blockage, and we are in a situation of no reflection whatsoever, and in a situation where there's no willingness to go further, and well, things do not move further. So this was the first reflection that I wanted to share. And the second thought that I have is about demand. There's this lecturer who was talking about traffic, and he was telling us about demand and offer. But I have to say that, well, the offer, the supply is very secondary to the demand. There are certain drugs that work and others which don't. And we have heard a lot about methamphetamine, but it does not work in France. It works in other countries, but not in France. So actually, what's quite determining is not the supply, but rather the demand of a certain substance. So you may use whatever packaging you want. This is not going to lead to a greater use of a certain drug in spite of the beautiful packaging. And then the media in France. Well, I have to say that they make useful remarks, and I'm talking about serious media, but they also talk about this permanent violence that is developed everywhere. And yes, they're right. However, they always stopped at these remarks, at these observations, and they never think about it, and they never question anything. And they are responsible for questioning certain things. They never suggest, they never question those who are involved and those who could tell about another option. And I know that in France, we cannot talk about drugs, and we cannot present them in a favorable manner. This is forbidden by law. But when it comes to media, we should expect from them that they offer something else, and that they question, and that they provide another vision, another point of view. But this does not happen very often. Thank you. I see that people agree. Okay. Any other question? Well, yes, there's one question. Please, a brief question with a brief answer. I'm going to be the devil's advocate. There's this guy called Michel Gandion working at the OFDT. He's just published a book called Drugstore, talking about what happens in Colorado. And we're 10 years behind them. And there are so many things that are worrying First of all, the considerable increase in concentrated substances. I'm not going to give you an analysis of concentrations, but there are THC rates which are so high. There are such high concentrations, and this makes this THC be very similar to weed and to resin. And this is the result of a capitalistic model, to put it simply. And the second thing is that, well, quite manifestly, and maybe after certain years of prohibition of cannabis in the US, the black market is regressing and there are new opportunities. And there are some specificities in the US. And actually, the fact that cannabis is not legal at a federal level make people in the business to earn a lot of money, but they cannot put this money in banks. And I have to say that I know that the battle is going to be harsh, but I think that we should see with a clear perspective what works and what is quite worrying for the future, especially if we are thinking about this model of business as usual. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to stop it here and we will resume tomorrow. So this is how we will provide public opinion with evidence and with data that will lead to clearer policies. And this is actually what our Swiss friends are trying to do. And we will hear more about this tomorrow. Thank you.